This is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WEFT, Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial, and this is May the 17th, and I'm wanting to take you on a field trip to Pope Prairie. And we've done this some before, but we're looking to perhaps, we're very pleased with the Pope Prairie, and we're thinking to perhaps even expand it with a kickstart. So I want people to know about the Pope Prairie, and so this will be a little bit more expansive. It's one of those things where you do a little bit, and then you do a little bit more, and then do a little bit more, and we might even be good for a grant sometime. So the Pope Prairie is 18 miles from town. If you start off from WFT, it'll be 18 miles. It is 1 mile north of Rantoul. The present Route 45 goes out and around Maplewood Cemetery, and thereby creates a triangle at the north and the south of the cemetery. And you have access through a road which is 3200. It's a section road. And if you turn on that, you turn to the left. There will be nearby a cell tower on the right-hand side of 45. And once you turn into the section road, there'll be a fairly modern electrical pole, which is recognizable. You go just 100 feet, and you will run into an old Route 45. It's on a little slope at that point, and people tend to miss it. So if you have gone over the Canadian National Railroad line, you've gone too far. Go to the next section road, turn around, come back. But it's on a slope for the Bloomington Marine, and we'll say more about that later. You can park on that same road. It goes all the way from Rantoul to Paxton. It was going to go to Kankakee in its day. It didn't get that far, and then it retired. So the interurban is there, and the railroad is to the west of the interurban, and the 45 is on the east side of the interurban. So if you do a transect from west to east, you go Canadian National, which was Illinois Central, and that's double wide because they had double trackage. Probably even 200 feet wide. I don't know exactly, but it often was the case. Then there's interurban, which more often was about 37 feet wide and a lighter track. Then came the road, which paralleled the railroad line. And it may have even been there before. I don't know the exact history, but that road in its day was a muddy road, and it went all the way to southern Illinois. If you had oxen or horses, drays and wagons, you would take 3 days to get to southern Illinois. You're on a moraine. That's where continental glaciation allowed a rock and rubble to come down from the Laurentian Shield in Canada. the ice caps kept moving south, and they brought with them rock and rubble. The bigger rocks, like houseside rocks, dropped out further north. There are a few glacial erratics that actually made it to Champagne. They're well worn and rounded and sometimes scraped, and they're striated because sometimes they were riding on the bottom of the glaciers and being scraped across the soil. So I'm going to take you into this moraine. The section road 3200 is to the north end of the triangle that was created by the new Route 45. Old Route 45 used to go behind the cemetery, but I think in the long run they were wanting to have a dual highway, and it would not have had enough room to do that between the cemetery and the railroad line, so they went out around the cemetery. You get to park on the northern part of this, north of the section road. If you want to park frontways, you drive in a little bit till you meet a gravel pit, not a gravel pit, but a gravel mound, and turn around conveniently and come out so that you're facing the road. You'll be able to recognize the situation because there's a heavy-duty, very yellow gate right there. So if I take you in, you will have to either crawl under the gate or go around the gate. If we're not there, you won't have a key to it. The gate is there because this road was a fine place for a retreat, but it's also a good place for dumping. And every year we would have to remove material. Eventually, the Department of Transportation kindly put in a barricade, 2 8-foot long, very heavy-duty concrete barriers. That was a problem for us because we had to then put our tools and equipment on a dolly and walk them in. That got to be a pain. But then they replaced it with a gate, and the gate is wonderful. We have a key and we can get in, and we can have visitors come in. We can have a bus come in with volunteers or with visitors and go down that road. And the cemetery to the south has cooperatively also put in a gate. So we have keys to that gate too, and we can go through and out by the cemetery. So that's much more convenient for us because although cars can turn on this old road, which was a highway, it's concrete now. It's probably concreted in the WPA era when people were having problems with the Depression. So I would suspect the concrete came in about the Depression era. The interesting thing is that I'll stand you here at the gate, and it doesn't look like a prairie here because we have a nice stand of cottonwoods. And cottonwoods were about the only tree that grew well on the prairie. It can handle drought, but it could also have deep roots into aquifers, not necessarily aquifers, but it could get to water. But they're substantial trees, and they're on the old interroad mostly. In the background is the railroad, the Canadian National Railroad, and it is well used. While we're working there, during the day, quite a few trains go by, and some of them are 200 wagons long. Some of them have an engine in the middle of the train and an engine pusher on the end of the train. So they have to negotiate a little rise, which is the Bloomington Marine, where when the world warmed up, all this rock and rubble was left in a mound, and that's where we are. We're halfway up the Bloomington Marine. This is a continental glaciation. You have rolling hills, a little bit more interesting than some of the flatland, but in front of that moraine you have an outwash plain, and that's where all the ice that melted dribbled into places like Flatville. And Champaign County was a swampy county and developed very late in the development of Illinois, because it was swampy and it had to wait till Deutschlanders and Frieslanders came from Europe and who knew how to drain the western parts of Germany and the eastern parts of Holland. And so now there are these drainage ditches and the water comes down. We have a nice little stream of water that comes through. It's the relic of the days when it was melting water. The glaciers might at one stage have been quite high, but after a while it was lower and it was alpine stuff, and the people find mammoth bones, and there was obviously Native American activity, because sometimes these bones have the remnants of arrowheads in there or spears, and so we know people were working the upper levels of the moraine before it retreated. The moraine has a front side which is relatively steep. It's not steep to people who come from mountainous areas. It's the front part of the moraine, the south part of the moraine. When you go up and over that moraine, it's much more gentle down towards Ludlow. It's very typical of a terminal moraine. So where you're standing, you can look up towards, I'm telling you, to park, and see the gravel that has been the Department of Transportation has stored there, and that that road continues 10 miles to Paxton, and we would hope that in the long run we might have a Prairie bike and hike trail there. So I'm wanting to have you visit, whether we're there or not, but it's kind of helpful to have some of us there that know the site, because not everyone knows the ins and outs of this particular prairie. You might wonder about the name. The name is Pope. Well, the Pope family owned Champaign-Urbana Sign Company, which includes billboards. And this road moves out and around the cemetery, which creates a situation where you have visual corridor, and if you have billboards, the lights shine on the billboards, and it's an advantage to advertisers. So the Pope family had that site for years, but then it was decided better to put in Interstate 57 west of Rantoul, and so most of the highway traffic that was on Highway 45 went to the 57. That meant the advantage of the billboards was no longer there. So we had been working on this prairie for many years. It's probably, I would think, about 80 years old. And a lot of this has been happening by happenstance. There's been some dumping, and there's been some off-road vehicle activity, and so we started to care for it. And when the site became available for sale, we bought, and that was quite some time ago now, but you're at the very north end of that now. So just to the west of you are some cottonwoods on the bed, which is a raised bed with drainage on either side, which is the interurban bed. Not always contiguous because it's a good gravel, and sometimes that has been used. To the east, there is a grove of young cottonwoods, and they sit in dampness. And it was damp even when vehicles used to go through there. It was damp because there's a little stream that comes through. If you look to the south, you see the old road, and you see some of the junk that came with dumping, some official and some not. And this week we've had Ron Slater come. We have the advantage of gates, but there are other ways that you can creep into the corridor. So Ron brought 20 steel posts, and we pounded them in such a manner and close enough that if you have an off-road vehicle that's four-wheelers, you can't get in. You can probably still get in if you're a motorcycle, but this is a very tempting place for off-road vehicles to come in because it's glacial till, and it's when it gets wet, it's nice and muddy. And you can put your four-wheeler vehicle into it and screw around, and you can do 70 years of damage to the prairie in 5 minutes. So we have put up inexpensive fences and suggested with signs that people shouldn't do that. And we've had not a lot of off-road vehicle activity in the last 3 years. Now, some of that junky material that's there is useful fence posts, but most of it is wood that's been left or soil, and there's in it fencing and other things. It's very hard to manage that area. So we would like to put a bulldozer in there, or a high hoe or a backhoe, and get rid of some of the junk and take it to the landfill and make that area more serviceable. If you turn around and look west, you'll look at another portion of the interurban. It is a raised embankment, and the interurban closed out probably in the 50s, so it's been a long time. And the space around each railroad line takes up a small amount of space linearly, and the right-of-way on the main line and on the interurban gives you a lot of remnant prairie, and the remnant prairie has crept up onto the interurban embankment, and it's sorted it out. Since it's gravel there, the plants are a little drier species. But just now, the first plants of the year, one of them is Golden Alexander, and it's out in flower. The grasses are not expressing themselves. They really, if you can scratch around them, you'll see the grass is starting to grow, but they have deep roots and they're alive and well, and they'll express themselves in the fall. If you move down a little further, you'll look across our main prairie. It has been a gravel pit, also known as a borrow pit. The idea was that if you were going to close a bridge and put in a temporary road around it, you could use gravel and and borrow it and bring it back. That never tends to happen. The glacial till with its gravel and its finely ground clay is really quite excellent road pack material, so it goes onto main roads. So if you look across the prairie from the road, the old road, towards the new 45, you'll be able to estimate that about 8 feet of gravel has been removed. It probably was removed about the time when the new 45 went in. And with a little bit of research, we can probably find out when that happened and when it was closed. But the areas around the gravel pit are virtually original soil, and they provide remnant species. When it was thought that they were going to put in a dual highway, they put in a dual highway. This is the Department of Transportation. They put in a dual highway to Urbana. One of the reasons was that the Air Force Base was there, and it was World War II imminent. There was a need to get troops in and out of Rantoul, and I think one of the feelings was that a dual highway at least should get to as far as Paxton. The land was bought in anticipation, and unfortunately for that plan, 57 went in west of town as an interstate and wide, and it took most of the traffic. Until then, all the traffic was on 45. If you came from Chicago to southern Illinois, you were on 45. Some of it you were on old 45. When you got to Paxton, you were on new 45. And we assume that the purchase was about that time, a little after the Depression. So the gravel pit is probably about 80 years old. And much of that has been regenerating prairie from the surrounding areas of the gravel pit and from the remnant prairies to the west near the railroad lines. We sort of like to see the remnants because we don't exactly know what was a remnant. It's up to our imagination and our research to presume what was. You can very easily plant a prairie that doesn't represent what was here when settlers came. We don't have much prairie left. The state was 2/3 prairie, but the state has formally or informally only preserved about less than 0.01% of the prairie that we have. 94%, of Champaign was prairie-based. That's why you have groups like Grand Prairie Friends with the name of Prairie Friends. They're advocates for prairie. Now, I want to take you out onto the prairie. The gravel pit is regrowth succession. Now, if you imagine the glaciers removing themselves 10,000 years ago, then you had raw glacial till, gravel, clay, whatever. And plants had to come in from the east, New England aster, for instance, from the south, cordgrass and some of the plants that are from wetlands in the south, and from the west. And that took quite some time. This is a regrowth succession, and that's different because at that time when the raw rock was exposed, the prairie was already established around, so you didn't have to wait for it to come in from refugia, north, south, east, and west. So it's been doing its own thing, and some of the places were only scraped enough that the roots of some of these plants have stayed there. And some plants, like some of the silphiums, prairie dock and compass plant, are have adventitious buds, so that you can actually cut off the top and the crown, which sometimes is about 10 inches round, and the root will regenerate. So there's some of that. But most of this has been from seed, carried by small animals or by wind or by activities that we don't know about. The site is still very raw. It will be perhaps 200 years before it really fills in, but little pieces are filling in. So you'll get a little bit of organic matter from a plant that started off some years ago. For instance, let's assume that it was a compass plant and dropped its leaves, and that created some organic matter. And then you have a purple cornflower. Then you have a liatris and a purple clover and New Jersey tea, and gradually you're getting yellow coneflowers and rosinweed, and these plants are shorter than any plant that would be on a typical rich prairie soil, but they're stuttering and they're doing well, and some of them group together and make little islands that then expand and fill in. The stream provides us with wetland, and an abraded stream means that it doesn't have a natural stream. It's not like a drainage ditch. It waddles all over the place. So if you put your boots on and waddle through this stream after a 5-inch rain, you can sink down in the mud. In fact, I was just a week ago taking photographs there, and if you stay still to take a photograph, you manage to drop into the clay, and when you lift out your foot, your boot stays in the clay. So it's that gummy, but it's the stuff that prairie does well in. It's not so successful for the invasives. Invasives like teasel like soft soil. They like moist soil. They don't like wet soil. So this is an advantage for us. The gravel pit area is relatively free of invasives like honeysuckle and autumn olive. They keep to the west a little bit. To the west, there is a strip where farmers decided to try to grow crops there. It didn't last for very long because the crops didn't grow very well on raw rock. But it disturbed the soil enough that we treat that as a garden prairie where we dipsy-doodle seed in. And over the years, that has been coming back to a prairie. It also attracts the invasive weeds because it is softer and perhaps has even been herbicided some. Ron Sleater has been very helpful. He's been a volunteer par excellence for 7 years, and he brings herbicide and spot herbicides, the teasel. Teasel has a huge rosette and it covers up the prairie. We also have a few other ones. One of them I was working on the other day is a cypress type evergreen, and it has children all over the place, and that eventually can take out your prairie. So one of these days I will have a calling for volunteers to remove that sort of plant. Some plants respond to being removed if you go deep enough. It's a problem to just cut them off. We've just had Heidi Lusler has hit a stump. We call them trippers. And if you remove invasive trees and leave a tiny stump, that can be a tripper and you can break your leg. And that's what happened to Heidi. She broke her leg, and so she'll be held up for quite a while. I've been very lucky for that to not happen. Sometimes if we're in a situation where there are just one or two trees, we'll leave the stump 2 feet high so that you can see that there's something there. If there's a crowd, then we cut them down lower so they don't sprout. But you sort of are aware that this is a site where you might have trouble, and you step carefully. I'm trying to think what else you see from this part. So if you look across towards the 45, you will see that the 45 has taken that advantage of the dual highway that they bought and didn't build, and they planted a lot of ash trees. And ash trees have taken the emerald ash borer and they've all died. And interestingly, as more light has come onto the prairie, it was there originally, and there's less competition, the original prairie is starting to regrowth and express themselves there. They also planted some of the evergreens that we have some problems with. Right against New 45, there is an embankment, because as you go up the Bloomington Marine, you're often encountering little hills, and this is a cutting, and that cutting is fairly rich in prairie, and it's nice to see because it has an angle, and it has you're able to see it. As we go to the bottom of our prairie, it's 9 acres. We are adjacent to some farmland which is not being used at the present, and we would love to buy that piece of land. We're thinking of doing a kickstart. I'm not sure how much of it is. I think somewhere between 5 and 9 acres. The current farm price would be perhaps somewhere in the $5,000 or $6,000 an acre. Not an awful lot of money, but what we think is that this site is so wonderful, or our prairie site is wonderful, that augmenting it a little bit will help to make it a key site on the possibility of extending this prairie 10 miles to Paxton, which is roadside prairie, but it's wide and it has enough width and resources for birds and butterflies and bees to mate and find food. The site that we're dealing with, the Pope Prairie, is often used by teachers, botanists, zoologists, entomologists, herpetologists, and the Natural History Survey comes by every once in a while and looks at this as a favorite spot. We have recently had a herpetologist there, and they've been looking for snakes and salamanders. So this has been known as a healthy prairie site for many years. It's also healthy because it has the elements of change. It has the original as well as change, so you can teach people about the difference. And so we think that if we expand this a little to the south, and if we upgrade the Pope Prairie itself and use the farmland to demonstrate and let people get close to the prairie without sort of walking over it too much, then that would augment what we do. And the cemetery to the south has already bought 6 acres of this area. It's loaded with teasel, but we figure that we can deal with that and do a reconstruction prairie there, perhaps have a little visitor center. So as you look at this, let's look at the geology. We've talked about the moraine, and so we look at the rise and fall and swampland, and south of the cemetery, on the other side of this farmland, is a site probably about 15 acres it might be, but it's swampland. It's swampland that looks just like Flatville looked like when early settlers came, and it had to wait for Deutschlanders and Frieslanders to come in and drain. This would be such a nice demonstration of what our local history is, our local natural history. The local sociological history is in the cemetery. You can see the families. You can see the Crane family is there, and all the brothers and the sisters are lined up because they were there when you had large families, and they no longer have that. Some people have 3 wives because probably they all died in childbirth. And I look at Lyle Shields. Right? Lyle Shields was county board chairman not too long ago. And it's people like Lyle who find it possible to help us into action with these sorts of programs. This nice little retired highway, old 45, goes 10 miles to Paxton, goes to Ludlow, which was at one stage the terminus of the Illinois Central Railroad, perhaps because they had to go up and over the moraine. At Paxton, they had to go over the Paxton moraine, and it is high enough that they have to have an engine there to push freight cars over the moraine. Eventually, that moraine was cut into, channeled so that the trains go through at a low level, and all that glacial till was brought down to Champaign to make underpasses for us. So you get to see the geology, you get to see the modern drainage ditches, you get to see the history in the cemetery, and what a wonderful site. It runs right into a east-west railroad line, which was called the Pumpkin Vine, and the Pumpkin Vine went east-west from Leroy over to Bloomington, right through into Indiana and Lafayette. We walked this line many years ago for prairie sites, and we settled on one at Gifford, which was near enough to town and near enough to nature that it could be useful, and it indeed became the first property of the Grand Prairie Friends when they were formed. Wendy Garrison, who was here recently, and she remembers walking on some of these railroad beds so that we could look to see whether a railroad bed at Fisher on the Pumpkin Vine or a railroad bed at Fuseland might be useful teaching research territory. So you have a possibility of a north-south trail meeting an east-west trail. It's not very long. We tried to get more of it, but it didn't succeed. It's gone back to farmland. But the railroad line is still active from there to Fisher. Wouldn't it be nice if we could take eco-tourists off 57 at Kankakee, come down past Loda where there's a nice cemetery prairie, and Grand Prairie Friends has been putting in a 9-acre buffer zone around it. These things don't happen easily. These are years of work. Some of this goes back to Bliss and Kendi and Getz and Vestal and others that sort of were the nucleus for George Fell going to Washington and creating the Nature Conservancy, which is now in all countries, or not all countries, but it's international. I just picked up a magazine from Australia, and there the Nature Conservancy has bought more or less desert land for preservation of the desert species that have lost out to irrigation that come. The same sort of thing has happened in California. So think about a national trace from north to south that would include Prairie. At the moment, it can be self-sustaining, self-standing if we just work with the Pope Prairie and convince people to go a little more. In order to do that, we have to have media like we're using right now. We have cooperation of groups like the Urbana Public Television and Jason Liggett, who has helped us no end to put up programs twice a week on Urbana Public Television, above and beyond the radio program, which is streamed. And so one way and another, we've been working for years to get people to know about this particular site. We have to convince people that it's not useful land that should be in corn and soybeans. Which just often happen. We just lost the prairie between Paris and Decatur because people want more corn and soybeans. And if you realize it, if you look at going back to Vestal's time, they were doing mining in Danville, and the mines there were of various age, and some of there were new mines would have a few species and lots of them. There were things like bloodworms and whatever. If you waited 50, 60, 70 years, you get a much more biodiverse pond. And when you have something like a virus strike, it may get everything, but it may get just part of your prairie, but just part of your pond. So we have to think about how we encourage biodiversity. And here we have biodiversity. And you have to know that a monoculture of corn and soybeans and pigs and cattle and humans is not biodiverse. So we have to teach about biodiversity. And here we have a site that gives that opportunity. We need something like a visitor center. You are probably aware of Anita Purvis Center, which is adjunct to Busey Woods, and that gives you the chance to educate. And not to do it in a very formal manner, but for people to actually enjoy. There's a raging controversy at the moment about geese, because there's too many geese in Crystal Lake, and the Park District has decided to exterminate them, much to the sadness of people who like to talk to the geese and feed the geese. But the extra food goes into the Crystal Lake Park, and you get an algal bloom, and also the feces are dropped in just anywhere, and they get leached into the Crystal Lake too. So we have to think about these things, and there we have a site that's representative of the geology, the agriculture, the urbanness of our landscape, and I want this information to get out. So we take this program and we put pictures into it that let you know if you can't go 18 miles to a remnant prairie, then we will give you the chance to see it on screen. That means a little bit of talent. We'd like some of you out there who know some of these things. We put this into a Vegas program, and you have to know how to clip and sort and move pictures. You have to have them taken in the first place. You have to have a room for them. You have to be able to search, and this is kind of fun, but it takes time and energy. But you are eventually convincing people to save some of their heritage. Many people just don't know that prairie was their heritage, and they plant trees. That's quite legitimate. You can hug a tree, but really, sometimes those trees are being planted on original prairie soil. But we want to let people know what we need to know. We need to know in a broader sense. If you're standing at Rantoul, that's the end point of the Yankee Ridge Moraine. And so on the east side of it is the drainage that comes from the Pope Prairie and goes to the Salt Fork and the Vermilion County. On the west side is the Sangamon River. On the south is the Kaskaskia, and the Umbra, and all these rivers run into the Mississippi, and they all take some of our excess nitrogen. And so we have to talk to agriculturists and know the soils, and some soils are sandy, so they don't hold a lot of ion exchange or chemicals that might be useful for agriculture, and they run off. On the other hand, that if you have deep soils like Drummer and Flanagan, you can attach more fertilizer to them. So we have to have people who know how to put less chemical on a sandy soil and more chemical on a deeper soil, more organic soil. And so that leaves us the chance to communicate. And some of this is legal, some of it is strange because we have a Jeffersonian plat and it goes north, south, east, and west so that people could find their plot, which they bought in Europe and didn't know where it was. Okay, but if your square plot, so you take a 1 square mile and it has a moraine going through it, then you need this sort of different treatments. And the ecology doesn't contain itself to a square. It's more organized. We have to know how to keep water on it. We have to have contour plowing so that you go around the morainal hill. We have to have places where water is not going to run off and form a river in Green Street, Champaign, because there's too much at once and it was all running off because we have lots of surface area where there's runoff. So we have to have detention ponds, and those ponds have to be healthy ponds. And we have to have people like Audubon, where a surprising amount of this sort of conversation comes from amateurs who can count birds, can be observant. Basically, we're teaching people how to get excited about their landscape, how indeed to love it in a way, give it tough love, but look after plants that many people don't know about. We can replant. We would try to do this at the farmland that we're talking about buying. It's fairly easy to grow a spectrum of 12 prairie plants. You can choose to do it at different times of the year. One time it is handy as you plant the seed in fall, and then if the snow, the seed falls through the snow and nestles there and gets a start in spring before all the weed plants and cultivars come in. And there are techniques that you learn about. For instance, if you're going to plant New Jersey tea, you have to get the tea out of it. You have to put it under warm water for a while so that you release the biochemicals that are in there that are going to leave it in the soil for a period of time. So just finding out the details of the bird or the bee or whatever. There's politics. You have to have groups like the Sierra Club that have the mission of working with the federal government to have EPAs and area set-asides and chemical scrutiny, like the Hudson River, which used to take all sorts of chemicals willy-nilly until people got involved and suggested that this wasn't a good idea. The same still happens, and we hope that some of that sort of thing creeps into the schools, and I think that happens. It's hard to do it. Some of the sort of stuff gets to be one-on-one. So one person talks to one person, and we're going out and looking and showing and to-do is good. But I see the clock is getting near to the hour, and I want to leave time for promotions. You have to realize that WEF provides us with a wonderful opportunity to do this program. Urbana Public Television has helped us to do the visual side of this. And we just applaud their existence for 30 years and their continued existence. So we have to do a promo every once in a while to encourage that sustainability. And by sustainability, I don't mean going for more and more and bigger and better. The world is running out of this and that, especially rainforests. There's only a limit to how many humans can stock the world. There's a limit to how many resources of gold or silver or iron or other. The world is finite, and we have to think about not going for bigger and better, but going for the regular, so that we don't have so many haves and have-nots, and we even it out a little bit. There will always be situations where we have people who are brilliant, who do things active in a natural way, and some of us don't have quite that aplomb, but we can contribute, and that's broken down sometimes to two parties not working very well together. So onward and upward. Thanks for listening. This has been Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And I hope we'll have some visual material to go with this. You have to go to Better Public Television's check to see where the program is running. But we hope to be there. Thank you. Bye-bye.